Morning, all, and welcome back to a rambling discussion with Charlie and Paul. Charlie, great to see you again. Such a fascinating discussion last week. I'm looking forward to jumping into the next topic today. How are you, Charlie, and how was your week?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. Really looking my one of my favorite things to do is ramble about things. So like looking forward to our conversation to continue that from last week.
Fantastic. Well, last week, Charlie, we obviously focused the discussion on corporate decision making, the benefit that these decisions have on the organization, and the negative impact these decisions have on society. So, for today's discussion, let's take that a step further, Charlie, and chat about the other side of the coin effectively. So, personal responsibility in the age of consumer technology. How does that sound?
Yeah, last week was a really interesting topic, and kind of thinking about this week. I'm reminded of an article I've read pretty recently, actually, about how the fast food industry has impacted customers' health over many decades and has really contributed to significant levels of unhealthy eating in the U.S. and honestly elsewhere throughout the world. Last week when we spoke about gambling, when we spoke about corporate responsibility, I was kind of wondering, do you feel when you see these types of trends that there's an element of personal responsibility needed or other factors to consider?
Yeah, it's a great question, Charlie, and I do for sure, right? So obviously we did discuss, right, the part that corporations, organizations, leaders play in ensuring that we've safeguarded, society against some of these ills that have manifested over the last number of decades. But there is a huge component that centers on personal responsibility that I'll touch on briefly. And I want to use an analogy to really kind of emphasize this, Charlie. So road safety in Ireland was very poor throughout the 80s and part of the 90s. And the way I generally think about these trends, and look, we've seen it in the tobacco industry, we've seen it in, road safety. We're now probably seeing it in tech to some degree. But I think about it in three ways. So number one, we need to ensure that there's education and awareness, right? So in other words, people need to understand the impact that road safety, as an example, has on other drivers on the road before they'll make the right decision for their own safety, the safety of their family, and the safety of their fellow drivers. I think the second thing is regulation. So we also need to make sure that as we understand better, you know, as an example, how alcohol impacts or impairs our driving ability, we need to pair that with regulation, right? So ensure that there are very specific and strict regulation that align with the education and awareness component of this. And then the third part of that pyramid is obviously personal accountability. If we take these three parts of the pyramid, so education and awareness, regulation, and personal accountability, I'm confident that regardless of which industry we apply this to, it shifts safety from a society perspective in a positive direction. And to close this out, Charlie, that is what we've seen manifest in Ireland from a road traffic incident perspective over the last number of decades, where we went from one of the worst countries from a road safety perspective to one of the best. And that included a lot of awareness campaigns on TV about, the incident rate and really graphic, impactful advertisements around why we shouldn't drink and drive. It included very strict regulation where you can't have one drink for fear of being over the limit. And that has severe impacts then on your license and your ability to work using modes of transport and so on and so forth. And then the third thing is, and this is the real interesting part for me, that shifted the culture in Ireland around road safety. So there's now this feeling that if people in Ireland have a drink and then drive, society will judge them. So there has been a huge cultural shift because of education and awareness, because of regulation, and that positively influenced personal accountability to ensure that we're doing the right things for ourselves, our family, and our fellow drivers. So yes, long way of saying, Charlie, in answer to your question, there is significant personal accountability needed to ensure that we're making the right decisions for society, but it has to be paired with education and awareness and regulation to really make that a sustained change in the environment.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I think the idea that you have this kind of like trifecta of balanced factors that ultimately contribute to how something that's potentially dangerous ends up getting used could influence the creation of a stigma, right? There was a social construct that came about because there was an education campaign, there was regulation implemented, and then you were pushing personal accountability onto people. And through that you were able to create this like stigma which invokes shame in an individual, which is generally like a thing that can help motivate them to do something differently than they did the day before. And it's interesting. So I listened to a podcast fairly recently that talked about phone addiction, and it talked all about how our phones, but our smartphones bad? Are we spending too much time on smartphones? There are these entrepreneurs who are on the podcast who talked about the fact that they were creating a light phone that didn't have apps on it. And it honestly reminds me a lot of just like any other kind of addiction that could exist out there, because they're talking about using phones as kind of like a binary of like good or bad, and ban this or don't ban this. But I actually think it's much more in line with like any other kind of like products that maybe have addictive qualities. Roadside safety is not like an addictive quality thing, but when you look at processed food, fast food, alcohol, tobacco, all of those have addictive qualities that without the degree of regulation and personal accountability and health and aware and kind of like awareness campaigns and education, people can go really, really overboard with them. You have a lot of safeguards that have been established over the past, decades with regards to the alcohol industry. Alcohol, gambling, tobacco, they all have to contribute funds to fund, Gamblers Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous. There's tons of regulation that exists out there to ensure the safety of the products. There's also a high degree of a personal accountability that's pushed on to people to know that yeah, you can have McDonald's every day, but that also may end up like not being the best thing for you. I think where we are with smartphones is we haven't even started to scratch the surface or even really identify that like phones and technology can be a really severe addiction. The idea that you're just completely out of control and can't control like what apps you're using or how often you're using it speaks to the fact that people who are talking about banning these things or getting rid of them have no concept that personal accountability needs to be a part of it. At the same time, it's hard to have personal accountability if you haven't really been educated and there's not necessarily awareness that like technology addiction is even a thing, right? That's then coupled with kind of there's no real regulation that exists out there, because I don't know that there have been like really conclusive studies that show how phone addiction can really contribute to detrimental physiological effects the same way tobacco and alcohol and fast food and processed food can. I'd wager they absolutely can, but it's going to be a minute until we understand that, which could ultimately impact regulations to get corporations to kind of like maybe do things slightly differently.
So it
Yeah.
feels, Charlie, like there's this kind of, I suppose, glacial shift that happens in certain industries, and we're possibly going through that shift from a technology perspective. So again, we've seen it in tobacco, we've seen it in the alcohol industry to some extent. We're now potentially at the very beginning of seeing that with tech. But I believe what you're saying is that it it's going to take some time before the education and awareness is there so that we fundamentally understand the impact this can have. That then trickles down to regulation and how we can really put safeguards around this technology to ensure that it's not impacting us overly negatively. And at that point, personal accountability comes into play, but only at that point when we fundamentally understand the impact that phones or apps or these technologies can have on our daily lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, I'm going to use processed food as the example, right? Like, when processed food came out and we became a thing, people probably knew that it wasn't the best for them, but they would eat it. There are studies out there that show that Oreos, fun fact, are more addictive than cocaine. And so products are out there that are more addictive to than kind of like class one federally regulated, federally banned substances. And without education to understand that, without studies to see the impact, we never would know. And analogously, we don't really understand the impact, the physiological, psychological impact of technology and smartphones in order to kind of like figure out how do we actually like deal with that, right?
Yeah, and it's really interesting, Charlie. So, first of all, I was not aware of that fact. The only fun fact I had about Oreos is that they're vegan, which was shocking to me. But nonetheless, I do. It's really interesting to me because tech in general um, has this addictive quality, and it's not, in my opinion, by its very nature. There's a purposeful design heuristic that's applied to a lot of tech, whether it be physical products or apps, that encourages use. And by virtue of that, encourages addiction. And I think for me, that's something that goes in the face of personal accountability, because as much as we may try to contain our use of, let's say, our phone every day or certain products and apps, there's an industry that pushes against that desire in a lot of ways. I'll give you an example, and I'm going to translate this to Las Vegas, which is always fun. But the one arm bandit and the slot machines in Vegas operate in a very similar way, where what they will do is they'll create these incentives to drive dopamine hits for people that use them, which means that they'll give a payout every X amount of pulls. And that incentivizes individuals to keep coming back in the hope that eventually they'll win the jackpot and so on and so forth. But it's all about creating that dopamine hit so that they create that addiction and use with the gamblers in those casinos. If we translate that to tech, and Robinhood is probably a good example of this, where they have a specific design heuristic that encourages use on their platform. And by use, I mean it encourages as many stock puts as is possible for a certain individual. There's confetti, there's certain colored buttons, there's a number of different design heuristics that's used, not just on Robinhood, but Robinhood is a good example that really creates that addictive quality on these products. So it's interesting that you brought up the addictive qualities within the processed food industry. The very same thing is happening in the tech industry. And as you said, it's too early to fundamentally understand the macro impact that that has on us as individuals. But once we do get to that point, I think it's going to be critically important that we regulate a lot of these, whether it be physical phone device makers or virtual software product makers, so that they're not encouraged to create addiction on their products.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a real hard thing to do because that kind of goes in the face of capitalism and what my profession is based around, which is building
Sure.
products that people want to engage and use and work with, right? So I think that's definitely going to be a super challenging thing to kind of confront. What's really interesting about technology and specifically smartphones, I think, is that there's this perception that they have caused us to be more disconnected from one another, right? So there's physiological and psychological impacts to it, but there's also sociological impacts to phone, or at least perceived versions of that. And their phones are bad, phones are terrible, they're ruining connections, people are lonelier than ever. And the thing that like really strikes me is if you go back 100 years, 150 years, and you look at when radio was invented, well, now you had a whole bunch of people who were sitting around a radio not talking to each other, listening to whatever was being broadcast out that's giving them some form of dopamine. TV rolls out, very similar thing, right? Home movies roll out, very similar kind of paradigm. There's a continued focus on this like thing, this piece of technology that is giving you some like dopamine feedback, but also is contributing to how you interact with other individuals. So I would wager that, when we think about how phones are impacting us on at least a sociological basis, it's really important to look at the full kind of like interactive technological ecosystem that exists out there and to really understand that like using a phone that isolates you is really no different than watching a TV program next to someone else that you're not talking to or listening to a radio with some other individuals. And the real question becomes, how as a society do we build in, I'd call, routines or new or social constructs or norms that recognize that that's a thing, and then kind of like help people be more mindful, be more present, be more able to connect with other individuals.
I love that, Charlie. What I get from these conversations is that you're an eternal optimist when it comes to the impact that these technologies can have in our lives. And I really appreciate that. In some ways, I look at the future as potentially a Ready Player One future. We're all hyper connected to some sort of a console, and our bodies are withering away and dying while we play in this virtual world. But I do appreciate the balance. There's historical context for very similar trends and themes that have happened that have not negatively or dramatically kind of created distance between individuals. But at least in my opinion, I think we do need to be vigilant around how phones or whatever the next thing, metaverse or otherwise, is, in order to ensure that it doesn't lead us down that path of isolation and further loneliness.
I love that you called me an eternal optimist because that's definitely the opposite of how anyone would ever describe me in general. Like I don't know that I'd honestly call myself an optimist. I'm probably way more of a pessimist, but I do see the optimistic side of how if we do things a certain way, it can be used to propel us into the future. No technology is neither good nor bad. It's all how it's implemented and used that ends up kind of like impacting, you know, what ends up happening with it. And I think the challenge is because it's not ban phones, don't ban phones, ban alcohol, don't ban alcohol. Those are the easy concepts to understand. But when you talk about that like trifecta of personal accountability, regulation, and health and awareness and education, getting the balance right between those three things is incredibly brittle and hard to get to, right? So I think achieving the things that I'm talking about are like, I don't know how realistic they actually are, but I do think there is a way if we kind of recognize the complexity and nuance that exists within these systems.
Yeah, fully agree, Charlie. Thank you so much. Another really engaging and enlightening conversation about how personal accountability plays a key part in negating some of the downsides to the immersive tech trends we've seen over the past number of years. My takeaway is that personal accountability is critical, but it can't be done in isolation. It can't be done without education, without awareness, and should be done in parallel to regulation and changes to our structure societies and our systems. So, fantastic, thought provoking conversation, Charlie. I really appreciate you taking the time again. I love having these Friday morning conversations with you. And I hope for all of those listening, you enjoyed the conversation. Please do engage. Let us know if you have any thoughts, feedback, and we hope to see you again in the very near future. Charlie, thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.